let's see if we're good here. Okay, for some reason I am not yet seeing any picture. Ah, here we go. Okay, nice. I think it should work now. La-di-da.
We'll check how long it will take me.
Okay, why does this not work? What is the issue? Please tell me. Let's see. Okay. Alright, so apparently this seems to work. And it's just the preview that's fucked. Which is fine. Yep. Okay, we got sound. Perfect. Okay. Just post that in the Flesh and Blood Discord too, so we get maybe a few more viewers. Abby, are you on the purple Discord?
I am currently not, no.
Okay, gotcha. Then I will just not add you there, because... Or just mention you by name instead.
Oh, good.
And I just pulled it up. It's working. The stream is.
Very nice. Stream looking good. Discord link invalid. Oh, that's possible. Yeah, I might need to be refreshed. I'll put a new one in the description. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we're good to go. All right. Welcome everyone. Apologies, we had a couple of technical issues. As you might have noticed, I haven't done this for a bit. Life got in the way, as they say. And yeah, but we're back now, and I'm joined today by both Tom and Abby to talk about New in the new hero from part the Mist Whale, the new assassin that we've all gotten to try out a little bit over the past couple of weeks. And now that US Nationals has passed and we've seen what New can do in action, both there and also in some of the past Battle Hardens over the last few weeks, we're here to talk a little bit about her and her place in the meta and where we think she might be going forward in these coming weeks. So thanks to both of you for joining me here today.
Yeah, thanks for having us. Should be fun.
Anytime.
Yeah, no problem. Very excited to talk about New.
So, like, the reason why I got the two of you specifically on here is that both of you have made new lists that go in radically different directions, basically. So you've both basically looked at the hero and her kit and her equipment, her ability, and decided that you value different parts of that kit in a very different way, basically. So Tom, for you, it's been basically, all right, how can I make this hero defensive? How can I make her like play the value game maybe a little bit more and not use chi all that much? That's kind of like the direction you've gone in, like classical assassin stuff, basically bolstered by her really good attack reactions and the fact that Traverse the Universe is just a pretty broken card. And that's kind of like the game plan you've been going with. And Abby, you've kind of went into the completely opposite direction. You just said, right, Mask of Recurring Nightmares is absolutely broken. I want as much chi in my list as I can possibly fit in there. And I just want to strip as many cards out of my opponent's hands as humanly possible. So it's kind of interesting to me that you kind of went into these like really very, very opposite directions with the hero. And you've both actually had decent success with it at like US Nats and the Calling in Minneapolis. So let's talk about that a little bit. Like, what were your initial impressions of the hero and why did you decide to go that specific route with the testing that you did?
Is that for me to start?
Either of you, but like maybe you can just start out for now. Yeah.
Okay. I think I did start, like many people, with 9 copies of Hiss and a bunch of Double Trouble and just trying to kind of make the most of these new Mystic Assassin reactions, because these are the ones that Uzuri never had access to and probably won't. These kind of one-costed reactions that target pretty much any relevant assassin attack, try to push the on-hit. Uzuri's always been limited to Shred, so
Pretty much, yeah.
I wanted to try kind of this max react style, and found quickly that it basically turns into a rune blade that blocks better. Sometimes your hands just don't do anything, and that the dislike I have of a hand that does nothing kind of pushed me more toward, you include Enlightened Strike and Sink Below, and you try to have some of these hand fixing mechanisms. And that fits my playstyle.
Okay. So it was less about this deck isn't capable of doing powerful things and more about it absolutely can, but the frequency of those things lining up and the frequency of hands that just kind of don't work is a little bit too high, and that's why you decided to go in the more like defensive low chi route, where you just kind of try to get maximum value out of her cards, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think you can maybe call it an Uzuri deck, but with like twice as many blues, and all of them are good. Something like that.
Okay, makes sense. So kind of like blue Zuri, but with more powerful reactions, essentially, and then blues that aren't just like filler, but actually do something that you want from the deck, right?
Yeah. Although I have been struggling to iterate the blue base, and maybe we'll get into this more. I think maybe Abby should talk about her philosophy. But
yeah, I think because if I remember correctly, Abby, you have kind of like a time limit today.
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay, right.
I have about like 40 minutes to an hour, somewhere in that range.
Maybe we start going a little bit more into detail on your list. And I've got this is Tom's list, like the one that he took to US Nats. And I think like 2 of your friends took basically the exact same list to Nats, and you placed like 15th, 20th, and like 25th or something, respectively.
yep,
Yeah, okay.
pretty much.
So like pretty good top placements in like a pool of what, 600 players, something like that, or
I think it was just under 5.
just under 500. So pretty decent overall, even if none of you made top 8. I think considering the fact that half of the Nats is draft, that's a pretty good record that shouldn't be taken too lightly. But yeah, let's switch over to what Abby has been cooking up. So this is the aptly titled Nightmare New list. And you can see immediately in the equipment there's a little bit of a difference here, and then obviously the big difference is this here. So there's 9 chi, basically almost the maximum you can cram into a list. And yeah, walk us through why you decided to, end up with that kind of path. Like, what led you down this decision route, basically?
Yeah, I think a lot of us, as Tom pointed out, started in early new testing with like action points are busted, hiss is busted, double trouble is busted.
Mm-hmm.
Let's abuse those cards as much as we can. Um, I think a lot of us also pretty quickly realized, again, as Tom pointed out, that led to Runeblade hands, that they're like clunky hands, where a lot of the time you had hands where like you drew 3 or 4 reacts and your hand did nothing. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously that's a problem for a deck that wants to be consistently disruptive.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the way I ended up going with the list, I was for a while on a really conservative, very defensive, more Azuri or Arachne style list for a while.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I realized over time, just limit testing, tried 9Chi, and very quickly realized that Mask, at least in my experience of new, was the most busted thing you can be doing in the assassin class.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Mask happening after blocks in a reaction based deck makes it so hard for your opponent to make profitable blocks.
Mm-hmm.
And so my deck over time has come to abuse that more and more of how do I play really overrate reactions to punish incorrect blocks on top of
Mm-hmm.
Mask to punish incorrect blocks on top of just in general playing a deck where even the opponents like Azalea, like Kayo, like Zen, who just want to say, okay, no blocks, I have to hope your disruption isn't enough. Mask is, in my experience, the best way to punish that as well.
Okay.
So for a while, this is not the exact list I took to Nat.
Mm-hmm.
Cut down the size and Rowdy locals were for a while 2 other stealth cards. I recently, this week in testing, have changed those to more disruptive blues, just to more consistently present disruption.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout the weekend, I realized most of the games I lost were because of that, is drawing one less disruptive card in throughout the game than I wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And so far in testing, cut down the size of Rowdy locals have really impressed to kind of fulfill that role,
Mm-hmm.
um, for sure.
I mean, you kind of end up at a point where you just cannot put any more disruptive, specifically blues in your list, right? There's a bunch of like disruptive reds that you could put in that you currently don't run. Stuff like Weakest Link, Amnesia, that aren't like universally disruptive, but kind of target, the meta at the moment quite a bit. Like, obviously, Weakest Link is really strong against Zen, against Kayo, against Prism, technically Enigma as well, I suppose. So you've got a good chunk of like the overall meta where these cards are actually good against them. And then you have the blues, obviously, where you're like, okay, you've got Persuasive Prognosis, you've got Surgical Extraction, and you have Bonds of Agony, and that's kind of it in the Assassin class. Like, that's all you can run. And then once you start going into the more generic disruption, you also quickly run out of targets, basically. So you've got Rowdy Locals, which is a new card from Part the Mist Whale, which is like decent disruption, but not overall amazing, I would say. And then you have, like you mentioned, Cut Down to Size, which is kind of does the same thing in a way as Rowdy Locals. It's just a little bit less flexible, and it only blocks 2, obviously. And then technically you have something like, I guess, Pursuit of Knowledge, which isn't really disruptive, but at least presents an on-hit that the opponent maybe has to care about. But there's just not that many disruptive blues if you're not playing Guardian, right? So that's kind of like what you're stuck with. So, but in your experience, like over the weekend, how has the aforementioned Runeblade hand issue, how has that played out? And how often does it happen that you just draw hands where you cannot present any meaningful game interactions? And are there ways to kind of mitigate that you found where you can like play in a way, maybe set up Arsenal in a way or do stuff like that, where you can kind of play around that to an extent and just mitigate the chance of drawing hands that just completely lose tempo for you?
Yeah, for sure. You'll notice on my list, I right now have 12 mainboard reacts
Mm-hmm.
and 3 sideboard reacts, at least on
Mm-hmm.
the attack reaction side. And
Yep.
then we also have obviously the hallmark of the list, the 9 chi.
Yep.
So that leads you to 21 misses,
Mm-hmm.
which on its surface is quite a lot. Like 1/3 of your deck being misses
Yeah.
means, at least in my experience throughout, I ended up playing um, roughly 16 rounds on this list throughout the weekend.
Mm-hmm.
And I think throughout the weekend, I had 2 or 3 hands where um, my hand just like did absolutely nothing and I completely lost tempo.
Mm-hmm.
Um, However, my list is actually made in a way where we try to minimize that as much as possible in other ways.
Mm-hmm.
As you mentioned, Arsenal is a huge deal in this deck. It's really, really tempting to take cards like Just the Nick that are
Yeah.
these like busted reactions if you draw into their combo cards later in the game. It's really tempting to Arsenal them. And
Yeah.
this list is something you just cannot do. It basically locks you into a failure card for your next turn.
Mm-hmm.
um, Chi is easier to Arsenal, only because Chi a lot of the times at least does something.
Mm-hmm.
Into every hero but Azalea, it has the fail case of turning into an attack.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the really big thing, and something I think is incredibly important to my list, is Second Lieutenant of Chi Moon.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this card on its surface is incredibly below rate, right? Just a 3 for 5. No no disruptive on hit, nothing. It seems to fail a lot of the things this deck is trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
However, with 9 chi, a lot of the times you draw this with a chi, and when you do so, you end up getting these 5 card hands, which Codex helps you do as well, which
Right.
helps make that 21 misses feel incredibly low. Um, and is an important part of the list of like, I'm trying to draw 5 card hands as much as possible. I'm trying to arsenal disruptive attacks as much as
Mm-hmm.
possible to just keep that tempo going, to make even like an all react hand actually be decent. Like obviously if Bonds of Agony is an arsenal and you have 4 reacts that you draw, you're feeling fantastic about your
Yeah, makes
situation.
sense. Right. So it's kind of like just really force attacks into Arsenal, basically, even if it means that you have to make suboptimal play lines where you like leak extra damage. You could have, like, let's say your hand is, I don't know, like Persuasive Prognosis, Just a Nick, and maybe like, I don't know, Art of Desire Mind, right? Where normally you would be like, right, I can just keep the Prognosis and Just a Nick and just play a really good on-raid 2-card disruptive hand, basically, that the opponent has trouble interacting with because the majority of the damage is in reaction step, right? So either they give me 2 cards and I can arsenal the Nick, or they just don't block and I can blow them out, that kind of stuff. And are like, if I'm reading this correctly, like you're saying basically in that scenario, I mean, obviously depending on game state, but you would be inclined to not block with the Art of Desire Mind, so you can arsenal that to prevent like drawing 4 reactions and your hand just doing nothing, basically. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, it took a while for me to get that play pattern, and it
Mm-hmm.
feels really, really awkward of like I have this really busted react hand I want to play. It is so important to get an attack in Arsenal so that um basically the main thing I'm looking at every hand, because for most hands of this deck my opponent's only at 3 or 2 cards.
Mm-hmm.
They're not throwing much disruption themselves, or at the very least that's not relatively easy to block. I am looking at my hand and trying to find if I can both throw disruption and get a attack in Arsenal is kind of my
Mm-hmm.
goal every cycle. So
Right.
like Art of Desire, Prognosis, plus just the Nick is that example hands, assuming we blocked up another card, we're on our
Mm-hmm.
turn or whatever. Um, it does obviously depend on the opponent. Obviously, like Kayo and decks like that cannot afford to block 6.
Mm-hmm.
That's quite different. Prognosis with the Nick it can be really powerful for that sense. Or at the end of the game, sometimes with that hand, I had a game against a Fatigue Olympia where I drew basically exactly that hand and ended up pitch stacking just the Nick and Prognosis to
Mm-hmm.
guarantee an end game kill.
Right.
Um, but for the most part, yeah, you would try to find a way to block if you're just a Nick, throw Prognosis, and
Right.
Arsenal Desire to guarantee you're disrupting this turn and next turn you at least have something to do.
Right. Okay, makes sense. Because like the like, you know, I haven't done a ton of testing on new, to be honest. Like, just didn't have the time so far. So most of my analysis is still through the lens of somebody who just played Uzuri for basically a year. And in Uzuri, something that you always want to try to do is leave Arsenal open so that in case you throw a stealth and they overblock it, you can just Arsenal your swap target, right? And like in New, the natural an analog to that would be like throw a stealth card, they overblock it, you Arsenal your reaction, right? That's kind of like the same play pattern generally. And in that scenario, let's say you throw the Prognosis, they give you 2 cards, you can't use the Nick here because, it just doesn't do anything. You just take the IP, you just Arsenal the Art of Desire Mind, keep the Nick for the next turn cycle, basically, and just lose, 3 value, however you want to, calculate that.
Yeah, for sure. I think another large part of this, besides a lot of the card draw on the deck, a lot of the Arsenal decisions, gameplay decisions, is the double Mistblade. That comes up a lot. I had a lot of people over the weekend talk about Beckoning Mistblade and how, why aren't you running another Spider's Bite? And I feel, especially in this list, really strongly about double Mistblade because it allows those cycles where you quote-unquote IP penalty yourself the next cycle to be a absolutely absurd cycle, like Art of Desire and Arsenal, any disruptive blue, a react, and another blue, and now Mistblade lets you play out your Arsenal while still throwing the disruption in your hand, and just leading to these really huge swing turns that not a lot of decks in the game can appropriately block profitably or get tempo back on.
Okay, makes sense. So if you have the Art of Desire, you have the Nick, and then you draw into any other attack, basically, you're set up for a double turn if you swing double Mistblade, essentially. Okay. Yeah. Makes sense, yeah. Okay. So Dylan in the chat asked to sell him on Rowdy Locals, where it's a card where you 2-for-1 yourself in a way. Which I get. I'm not saying Rowdy Locals is necessarily a good card. I think it's the best card in that slot that you have access to, and the slot specifically being Disruptive Blue that also blocks 3. I think that's kind of the spot where it is. Obviously, it's not as good as something like Prognosis or Surgical Extraction. It's not as good as that, basically. I think what it does do is it allows you to play another disruptive blue that is kind of annoying for the opponent to play around. And you have a couple of play patterns with the card that aren't necessarily face up. For example, you can play Rowdy Locals without having another card in hand. And then when they don't block it, you break your Stilettos or Arousing Wave, which gives you a card in hand that you can then discard to make them discard a card, stuff like that. So it's kind of the best worst card, I guess, in that spot that you can run. But I haven't actually played with it yet, so maybe you can give us a little more insight about that. Or maybe we should get Ollie in the stream as well, because I know he's a huge fan of Rowdy and has been running it basically from the start.
Yeah, I know he has really strong feelings about that card. Yeah. I kind of see Rowdy Locals the same way I see E-Strike. They're cards that I really, really wish we didn't have to run, but we just do for consistency. E-Strike is just the third go again, but in Assassin, unfortunately, that's the best we got. We have Give and Take. You could run Yellow Hisses. Those are just not, at least so far in my testing, not really consistent options. E-Strike at least pretends to be on rate sometimes. And I think Rowdy Locals, I think something that's really important, especially if you're building your list around it, is just we can leverage small hand sizes way better than the opponent. It's kind of the same philosophy as Mask, right? Is Rowdy Locals is forcing you and your opponent to play on as low cards as possible. And while, yes, it is card disadvantage, and don't get me wrong, I'm allergic to card disadvantage and hate that we have to play the card, it allows some absurd turns, double blue Rowdy Locals Codex is guaranteeing your opponent down to 2 cards in hand before you throw your Leave No Witnesses, your CNC, whatever. And, that's just, a guaranteed time walk on, Rowdy Codex and any 2 blues. Likewise, Rowdy plus a Mask, Rowdy plus, I got a really funny game in testing earlier today where the opponent's at 1 and I throw Rowdy Locals and the +2 ended up mattering, where now they have to double block my 0 cost attack. It is a lot of, as you mentioned, a lot of like small interactions that make it a lot better than it looks. On top of just in general, the more you disrupt your opponent, all of your disruption kind of exponentially helps itself. Like again, locals plus a mask trigger is way better than either individually.
That makes sense, yeah. Like, generally, I think, like you said, stripping cards kind of gets better exponentially the more you do it. So, like, if you strip one card, most decks can kind of play around that to an extent and then just play their, like, 3 or 4 card turn. If you start stripping 2 cards, a lot of decks start kind of falling apart, right? So, apart from the decks like, I don't know, dual wield warrior or something that are kind of like meant to operate on 2-card hands, you know, and that's like their comfort place basically. But a lot of the decks in the meta currently really want to have larger hands, and then if you can strip those cards down, you can kind of like, you know, just mess with their game plan to a point where you just win over time because you impact their efficiency so much. So Tom, what's your opinion on Rowdy Locals? I think you've tried the card for a bit, and if I remember correctly, your impression was like, this is really bad surgical. Why should I run this? If I remember that.
That was my initial impression. I tend to take a bit of a data-driven approach with these card choices because Hellstar does track a lot of them. It can be muddied a little bit, you know. Sometimes you play with people you trust, and sometimes you don't, and that can skew things. But mostly, I think the numbers work to make card choices. So Rowdy, I ended up mostly just blocking with and pitching. So at that point, I just sort of felt, look, it should be a different tool for a specific matchup rather than trying to be this catch-all. Although I can say my most impressive moment with it was during an endgame state where the opponent had no choice but to turn on the +2 power. And I do think that is very strong. Like, having a 0-cost blue that can be 4 power in the endgame is not nothing.
Yeah.
And in a list that, first of all, plays more blues, and in a list that is trying to disrupt all the time, I think Rowdy makes a lot of sense. But my deck is not that.
Okay, fair enough. So, like, you don't run it because you think like the consistency of disruption in your deck is high enough, and you don't necessarily try to strip 2 cards every turn cycle. You're settling for defending effectively and stripping 1 card every turn cycle. That's kind of like the overall idea of where your deck is trying to go.
I think while that may be true, the way I would kind of explain the philosophy is really about the matchups and the meta. So for instance, the 3 that my group and I really wanted to target were Kayo, Azalea, and Zen. So the idea would be that these are kind of the top proactive heroes. They maybe would make up 40 to 50% of the field. So we should have a game plan that kind of spans all of them. And it turns out, against most of those, or all 3 of those, having a blue that can either block 3 or pitch to play your actual disruption, like CNC, Sensor, etc., it really doesn't matter what the blue is, as long as it's blocking 3, like, it gets the job done. And I'll take Kayo as an example, right? So the game plan into Kayo really isn't to strip cards every turn. The game plan is to survive, build their banish full of blues, and then kill them with their own cards. It's almost always a value game for this strategy. It's not really like roll disruption until they die, though that can happen because assassin high roll is a thing, though people don't like to admit it.
Yeah, like, I think it's because assassin high rolls just feel really, really, really bad to sit across from. Like, it's probably one of the worst experiences in the game to get high rolled by an assassin, because it feels like you just cannot do anything. right? That's kind of what we do. If it's like I'm dissecting your deck, I'm stripping multiple cards every turn, and you just never get a foot in the game. That just doesn't feel good to interact with, you know. So I can understand that people kind of really dislike that experience. So that makes sense. So I guess your thesis is like, I don't need Rowdy locals. I just want blues that block 3, and then you just run stuff like Warmongers, for example, instead of Rowdy locals, right? Because it's a tech blue basically, and it fulfills the criteria of blocking 3.
Yeah, one of the advantages that New has over Uzuri is because the deck wants a certain number of blues minimum, you get to have these generic powerful blues kind of for free.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they take up slots in the deck, but because you're trying to bring a counter to other strategies,
mm-hmm.
it does pay off to bring the actual counter and not something else.
Right. So you would rather run like Warmongers than something like Unmovable, for example, which is like less flexible kind of in that regard, because you have to have another card to make it work. And Warmongers just kind of works on its own in the specific matchup where it's good, which is Azalea, right? So
yeah, and in other matchups, it performs the same role as something like Rowdy, where it either blocks 3 or pitches 3.
Pitches 3. Sure.
And again, this is kind of, you know, I'm using Rowdy as the guinea pig. This is the case for a lot of these blues, like even Cosmic Awakening, which was in the deck for a long, long time.
I remember that.
Eventually you just look at the numbers and it's like, well, I've played this literally 1%.
Yeah.
You know, what is actually the purpose? So that's why a lot of the blues are the way they are, and I think we can look at Pick to Pieces actually as another example of this.
Yep.
You almost never want to cast this.
Yeah.
It is usually very bad. If you're casting against Enigma, it's usually pretty bad because you're behind and you're trying to scam them.
Yeah.
But when the scam works, it wins the game, and we kind of need this outlet against Enigma. We may talk about the matchup at some point, but I actually think it's one of the weak points of this list as the Enigma matchup. They have so many high rolls available to them that I think we should have, you know, if we were having an extra week or so, I think we would have come up with a better final, like 4 or 5 slots, just to kind of tech toward Enigma a little more.
Okay, I'm interested in that because like my Nats is still coming up in about 2 weeks, so I'll take any Enigma tech I can get. For that matter, also any Prism tech I can get, because also like Prism feels like one of New's worst matchups, I think. But so Lewis in chat asked, why are you not running Mask of Recurring Nightmares? I think that's probably like the big thing everybody is going to ask when they see your list, is like, why are you not running the equipment that is basically meant for New and that feels like her chi payoff into every matchup where the opponent doesn't play good blues, which is like, to be fair, the majority of matchups, because like Guardian is non-existent at the moment, and then that kind of leaves Brute, specifically Kayo, because he just has to run all of these blue 5 power attacks, and most other decks just don't run blues that we can do a whole lot with.
Right.
And the ones that do typically try to sideboard them out if they're playing against New. So why are you going the route of, if I run into a matchup where they don't have good blues, my chi is just useless? What's the idea behind that?
So this is a bit of a long story. I'll see if I can shorten it. Maybe we'll start with kind of the concept we had at the beginning of the stream. The early New build kind of had a lot of react. Likewise, we had, or at least I did, have a lot of chi and trying to use the mask and leverage these interactions. But I kept finding myself in scenarios. Maybe take Azalea as an example. On hits are very punishing. You could draw the hand with 2 or 3 chi in it, and you're forced to no block or if you do block down to both of the chi that are remaining, you better hope you have an arsenal attack action. So this type of errand led me to cutting the chi, and below a certain point, the mask gets about 1 activation per game.
Yeah.
Which is so you're comparing this 1 mask activation essentially to traverse, or if you look at my sideboard, balance of justice.
Yeah, sure.
And it just seemed like if we could come up with a way to get the chi on the bottom of the deck without using mask, that would just be better.
Mm-hmm.
So the primary way to do this is Path Well Traveled. The card is way too good. I think... No. I know for a fact that the reason the legendary keyword is on the Transcend cards is because of Path. If you could run this card as 3, things would be way different. I would probably be on more like 5G if you could run 3 of these. I mean, it is just so good.
That makes sense, yeah. I think it's specifically good for Assassin, right? Because access to reliable go again is just something that so far we did not have. Flat out, full stop. We just did not have that. We had stuff like, obviously, you could run Razor Reflex, you could run the Black Tech Whispers, right? But those rely on you actually hitting the opponent. So the opponent can play around that by doing something that they already want to do into Assassin, which is playing D-Reacts, right? And then Path Well Traveled, and as well as also Hiss, and also Beckoning Mistblade, all of those just give unconditional go again. And let's put Undertow Stilettos in here as well while we're at it, because they also give unconditional go again to anything that you want to run. Which I think is why most new lists that I've seen so far aren't running Black Tech Whispers, even though you do tend to make some silver with new. Even if you only run Leave No Witnesses and Surgical, the deck has a higher chance of generating silver, I think, than you would in Uzuri, just because the reactions make it more consistent that you hit with these. But Stilettos just being on the board and just giving go again no matter what the opponent does is just so powerful compared to Black Techs where they can play around it that there's just no reason to do that. So yeah, I get the reasoning that you would want to run more Path if you could.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So an example for one of the easier ways to get a chi in your deck to search with Traverse later on is you have maybe the ideal case is Persuasive Prognosis, the Path Well Traveled, and any card that cares about blue, pitch, or another card in hand. So you could Prognosis, Path Well Traveled, pitch and play E-Strike, or bottom with E-Strike, or pitch and play Command and Conquer. Or even if you have Tunic up, like 2 daggers into a Codex can be pretty good with that final, with the resources. So that's the easy way to get a chi in your deck, and then you're just ahead of Mask again, right? We're on a low chi, so you're activating Mask maybe once a game.
Yeah.
So you're ahead of Mask if you're doing this low chi thing. Another way to get a chi to the bottom is you've already got a card with go again. Levels of Enlightenment is the best one for this usually. But Hiss can also work, so you can have a blue card that you cast and you care about casting, like Bonds of Agony, Hiss it and Transcend, and then use the blue pitch for the rest of your turn.
Right. Yeah,
okay, so these are ways to kind of get your chi into the deck, and then something else while we're just on the low chi topic. I'll ask you to show the Zen sideboard, where there's actually no chi whatsoever.
All right. I get that. That makes sense, because Zen doesn't run blues that are amazing for us to cast. He does run a couple blues that you can play. You can go blue Descendant into blue Bonds into something, but it's not amazing amounts of damage, I guess. Yeah. All right.
So this is kind of the extreme end of the logic where it takes you.
Yep.
Right? If you're not doing a bunch of chi because you're not on Mask, then it leaves you potentially with a sideboard plan that could side out all of the G.
Okay.
So the question is, if you were to do that, where would that actually be good? And like you pointed out, Zen doesn't have too many of these. These blues that are worth playing. So the hero power's not as good. And really, Zen is like, they're looking to keep the 5-card hand, or 7, if they're blocking with equipment. So like the mask can be useful for interacting with that, but sometimes it'll just like take a crouching tiger if they block with boots or what have you. So we really did want to try to lean into this idea of, okay, if we don't do any G, we could always block out the combo turn, use Balance of Justice to stay ahead on life, and then just do like annoying assassin stuff for the rest of the game. And it tends to work out surprisingly well. Like, this is not something I would be doing if the results weren't there. This idea seems like really stupid on paper.
Okay. I mean, if it works, it works, right? That's kind of like how it goes. You just try stuff and then something sticks, right? So, Abby, one question I got for you pertaining to this whole discussion is like, did you start out your list from the beginning with 9 chi, or was that something where you started out with something like, quote unquote, more sensible? Of like, I think a number I've seen a lot is like 7 or something. A lot of people start with like 7, mostly because there's a couple of chi cards that are just kind of bad, like Drop in the Ocean isn't very good in new. And then like Stir the Pot is okay because you can just play it without needing a target for it. But it doesn't really do something that you necessarily need, you know, that kind of stuff. So did you start out with 9, or did you go, okay, I have a certain number, and if I go below that number, mask doesn't make any sense anymore, kind of like how Tom just said?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I agree with a lot of Tom's reasoning. I think if you're going on a low chi list, I am of the opinion that mask is one of top 3, maybe higher, best pieces of equipment in the game. However, the price of building around it is high. I mean, Drop in the Ocean is a fantastic example. The card sucks. It's so bad. But it facilitates a way of playing the deck. I really, really wish, besides the price, obviously, that I could fit the landmark in this deck for this version of the deck. I, for a while, before Mask was revealed, was running 1, 2, maybe 3 chi of like the Path one, the Banish one, and Preserve.
Yeah.
And then Mask was revealed, and I, for a while, tried 6, not running Drop, Rain, and Rising, I think were the ones I wasn't running.
Okay.
And then tried 9 like once and just didn't go back. I had one really high rolly game where I activated Mask 9 times in a row and was like, I need this to be a possibility of playing new.
Okay.
My experience in testing, it's interesting that me and Tom both were incredibly worried about the Zen matchup and went different ways. One of the reasons for me, I am always on 9G, is the Zen matchup. Is like, in my experience, the one turn I don't draw the chi and don't disrupt is the turn they do 20 plus damage. And needing to mask every single turn forces them to block with boots, forces them to find a way to produce a tiger kind of inefficiently on your turn. But if you are not on this absurd amount of chi, where drawing a chi every turn is a game plan you can shoot for, I 100% think the no chi plan is the more consistent plan in the matchup. But it's part of why, for my list, like I'm on Rowdy, Locals, and Cut Down the Size, is all for the Zen matchup. Is just like the turn Zen gets to keep more than 3 cards. They do 20 plus damage. Then next turn they do that, they kill you. So my game plan is just never let that happen. And the other game plan is obviously I will just block you out and you will fatigue, which even with my list I've gotten kind of close to sometimes with like masking and blocking with 3 or 4 cards every turn as the game plan.
Okay, but I can imagine it's like the issue with your list is, right, like if you drop a turn of consistent disruption and then Zen gets to keep that 4 or 5 card hand and you draw into a hand that has like 2 chi in it, you can't block, so you can't even fade the damage. So that's kind of like it's sort of like the all gas no brakes kind of mentality. You have to keep lining up that disruption every single turn, because if you don't and he gets to keep a hand and your deck is like 1/3 of your deck doesn't really block, basically, okay, 1/3 is, not that, it's not that many, but 1/6 of your deck doesn't block well. Let's put it that way. I think that's pretty realistic because you do run the 9 chi, right? So there's a decent chance that you could just draw like 2 chi or maybe a chi and a codex or something on your next hand, and then you just can't block efficiently, and that's an issue that you have. So I guess that makes sense. Like, maximize the disruption, maximize the chance of stripping 2 cards with every hand, basically. But yeah, that's kind of interesting. So maybe as a question for both of you, do you think there's kind of like a middle ground with these two mentalities where you can go, okay, I have like a modicum of chi, like 6 or maybe 7 or something? Or is it like either you go full chi or you go low chi, simply because of the way that both of these decisions warp your deck building? And I know, Ollie, you're watching this right now. Maybe you can talk out about this, because I think you're the one with the most experience with like the middle amount, or like the middle ground. I hesitate to call it a hybrid list. I don't think we're at that point yet where we can talk about hybridizing lists, but sort of like middle ground where you just run a bunch of chi, but not all of them, and you don't build your entire deck around it, right? Because that's something, Abby, that you've also done, is like you didn't just include the chi, you also included chi payoffs, which I don't think any other list actually runs. So you have stuff like Second Tenet of Chi Moon, you have Tide Chakra in your list. Like, you have these cards that actually benefit from transcending and then offer above rate payoffs when you do manage to transcend. And I don't think any other list runs those, simply because they don't run enough chi to actually make those cards worth it. Like, Tide Chakra at face value, if you don't transcend, is just bad. It's just a 1 for 3, right? And like Second Tenet of Moon, the same. It's an on-rate blue, but this is basically like Raging Onslaught if you don't transcend, which is like, it's fine. It's a Raging Onslaught that you can react on, at least with stuff like Venomous Bite. Not terrible, but like, it's a pretty mid card if you're not transcending a lot, basically.
Yeah, I think Tide Chakra specifically, the fail case of Tide Chakra is not one that I'm scared of that much. Second Tenant is very, very bad though if you don't hit it. That's a card. Fortunately, it loves being arsenaled and lets you have a really good 2-card hand your next cycle. But Tide Chakra is just reaction speed come to fight. And like, sometimes, a lot of the times, it's also just the nick that targets anything. And like, I don't know how many times you guys have resolved just the nick. That card is not fair at all.
Yeah, no,
and
it's
Chakra
not.
kind of does the same thing.
It is not. That's true.
Yeah, I think to answer the like middle list, obviously we have people in the community like Ollie who have shown that list can work. You can build around it. I think, at least in my experience, high chi and low chi are very, very different in how you play. Like, Assassin historically is a great 2nd, 3rd, 4th cycle deck. But the more chi you put in, the worse your 2nd, 3rd, 4th cycle is. Okay. Whereas, likewise, on this first chi variant, I am incredibly focused on first cycle of like, how can I make sure I win first cycle? How do I make sure I disrupt every turn first cycle, set up these really consistent first cycles, or have a incredibly important pitch stack turn that can close out second cycle? I would imagine, I don't know what Tom's experience is, but in a low chi variant, it's a lot more like Azuri, where you can afford to be way more patient, like, I will win second cycle, it's okay. And that middle chi variant maybe lets you float between certain matchups you want to be first cycle, certain matchups you want to be the slow third cycle deck.
Yeah, I did do quite a bit of homework actually leading up to this, because in the testing we settled on the low chi deck maybe like 2 or 3 weeks before the start of the event, and there was so much opportunity cost for trying other things. We just had to like hone in on, we're not playing auto chi, like what are the game plans. But the past 2 days, I've tried out kind of, about a 6 chi version, and I'm actually enjoying it quite a bit. I think there's a lot to explore with this hero, and I actually wouldn't be surprised if by the Pro Tour Amsterdam I'm on like 6 or 7 chi with mask and just something quite different from what I brought to Nats here.
All right. It's kind of interesting, like, cause I don't think this list is fixed yet, right? Like I don't think there's like a best new list at the moment. Um, Simply because we're still adapting to stuff essentially. Um, let's see. There was
Yeah.
yeah.
The meta really does matter, like more than anything, in my opinion. If so, for instance, at US Nats, Enigma was over 10% of the meta. Maybe it was something like 12. I forget exactly, which is not what I expected. I figured the Zen zeitgeist would carry way too much, and all of the Enigma players would realize, like, look, we have 10% into Zen win rate. We should not probably bring Enigma. And I think because it's a split format, this reasoning maybe wasn't the best from our side, and so we figured Enigma would be quite poorly represented. But the point is, like, if you bring the wrong plan because of what you expect the meta to be, you're not going to do as well as you thought. In fact, of the 4 losses that no 5 losses my friends and I took on the weekend, uh, they were 2 to Prism. Actually, the one that top 8 at Austin Summers, who had kind of this 20 Spectra, like just full almost like original Prism, right? Just swarming the board.
Okay, right. So like the Vestige combo, lots of Spectra kind of plan.
Yeah, like Odorath and Parable and Haze Venning,
okay. So
right?
like really the full thing. Okay.
The full thing. Yep.
Yeah.
So
right.
the 2 of the losses were for that, and one of them was a close loss to an Enigma. And like, for instance, we just didn't think illusionists that were this greedy would actually show up. And it's hard to say. Like, there's no counterfactual to this, but one might reason that we didn't snag a top 8 because we disrespected those strategies a bit too much.
Okay. Right.
So yeah, like I'm really looking for what happens in future Nats and how can we kind of tweak our disruptive style to meet that.
Yeah, because I think the US Nats was kind of like the let's see, maybe like a litmus test, sort of. Like an early impression of a somewhat fleshed out part the Mistveil meta. Because like the decks that we saw at the first couple of Battle Hardens, right, were like, they felt really raw, I think, and like unfinished essentially. Where people were just like, they had 1 or maybe 2 weeks of testing. Basically, most of that was on Talishar with cards that sometimes didn't function well because they weren't like fully implemented yet. And then maybe you like printed out cards ahead of time, proxies just to test stuff in like your testing group or something. And that's kind of like what you had to work with, right? And now like that the set has been out for a couple of weeks, I think US Nats has been like the first really big event where people were bringing these new decks and doing well with them, obviously. But I think that the next couple of Nats that we're going to see are going to be a little bit more refined, right? So I'm talking about like the larger ones that we've got coming up, stuff like Canada, the UK, Germany, basically, where you have like 100+ players, right? I think that's kind of like the big parts where you can expect to see a little bit of variation and a little bit of like more refinement going on, I think. Obviously tempered by regional differences, right? And I think those are more relevant than people sometimes give them credit for. Where like you think you can expect something like the US meta and then just European players just have completely different play styles. And then that ends up actually shifting the meta quite a bit sometimes. But do you think that by the time we get to the PT Amsterdam, we're going to be at a point where you can say the meta has settled now and I can really prepare for stuff? Or do you think PT Amsterdam is still going to be like, okay, let's see what people bring. We might not be able to make the right calls here. Or somebody might be able to bring some kind of breakout deck that nobody really expected.
Right.
Yeah, I feel like. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I'll keep it short. The meta will evolve by then, without a doubt.
Mm-hmm.
Players will understand that Zen was the breakout deck at USNF. Like the whole weekend was kind of a Zen show with some Kano sprinkled in the calling. And people will come up with plans, and they will be on the order of what we did with this new deck, except with other heroes, and things will shift from there as Zen has to adapt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's kind of like the big thing now is that people have to come up with a way to reliably beat Zen. He kind of feels like the Lexi essentially of the meta that we have right now in a way. And more so than Kayo felt like during the heavy hitters meta for some reason. I feel like Zen is a deck that people need to adapt more to beat compared to Kayo. Maybe also because there's more stuff you can actually do to beat Zen. Like there's more tech you can bring that's good into Zen compared to stuff you can bring into Kayo. I feel like Kayo is a little bit less or like more resistant to you bringing tech that actually does anything relevant against him. And with Zen, you have a lot more meaningful, impactful cards that you can bring that can actually disrupt him or like, you know, mess with his game plan in a way. So I can see people starting to bring like stuff like weakest link amnesia, you know, stuff like that you can just generics that you can cram into any deck, just trying to keep up with Zen. And then maybe the decks that cannot run these cards efficiently kind of fade into the background a little more. Because I do think Zen is kind of like the top dog at the moment. And I don't think that's going to change much, to be honest. But I could be wrong there. Like, not sure if the meta is going to evolve in that direction. Or if maybe some other deck is actually going to be able to surpass Zen. Let's see. Let's see if we got some questions from the chat. So, Cardfight King has 2 questions. One is, what are your opinions on E-Strike? Because it's always felt pretty mid, since it's vanilla essentially. So, like, I think it's just glue, to put it short. I don't think the card is flashy. It doesn't do anything that's particularly good. But there's never a hand where you can't do anything with E-Strike. Even if that anything is just block 3.
Yeah, I feel like I 100% agree. I've kind of thought about bringing in, so like give and take is something I know a few people have tested. I haven't really liked it so far. I've kind of thought about bringing in the Nimble Strike tech from Missouri of just like an actually on rate go again versus where E-Strike is. But like there are some matchups where like coming in for 7 or 5 draw a card is really important. It's just tough. It's one of those cards that's like has just enough text and just enough of everything to be the right choice there, but like I could see in like an expansion slot or another assassin set or something like that, E-Strike being a card we just never have to run again and all of us being happier for it.
I mostly agree. I think I'll use kind of a hypothetical to explain this. So let's say you were going to a tournament and you knew for a fact 90% of it would be Zen.
Mm-hmm.
You would never have E-Strike in this list. You would have Censor, Amnesia, anything else over it.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out that not 90% is Zen, and you can't even predict close to 90% of what the right. Like if you wrote down the percentages of the heroes at one of these majors, you wouldn't get 90% right. You maybe get half, maybe 70% if you're lucky, right? So, given this dynamic, given that the metas are so hard to solve, especially early on like this, you do just have to concede that you're going to be running a card that's probably worse than something else in its slot. And you only know when the pairings, your opponent flips up their hero, tells you what they're playing. So E-Strike is one of those that, because it serves this role of kind of like fixing your bad hands and at the very least can do some kind of aggressive stand into some of those slower decks. Like it does deserve the slot still, but I would agree. Some expansion slot that performs a similar role critically, I think would have to be an attack action. Like you're not going to put copies 4 through 6 of Hiss in the deck over E-Strike still, right? Like it needs to be an attack, needs to do something. But I could see it.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like I think the card is just aggressively mid, but flexible enough that you kind of have to run it in a way, just because that flexibility allows you to always get value out of it, basically. So it's good in large hands, it's good in small hands. Basically works with any hand size except one. That's the one scenario where E-Strike is bad. If it's the only card that you have, then it's terrible. But in any other hand size, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's always a solid card, and you can always get some use out of it, basically. Particularly because you are a deck that has access to Slither. And using Slither on E-Strike is actually pretty good, because then you can basically play E-Strike for free because you redraw the card that you bought him. So in that scenario, you can actually use it for hand fixing and still continue your turn.
Yeah, one of the plays that I have been trying to line up more and more is with Siren's Call. Because you're doing two things at once. You're like hitting them in the face and you're disrupting.
Yeah.
And like most of the time for a deck like Assassin, and actually most decks in the game that aren't like Ninja and Brute really don't like this middle of turn variance when you're drawing a card. You don't mind it on their turn, right? Like Balance of Justice is very good because you get to see whether it's a 3-block and defend or attack with it come your turn. But when you're drawing in the middle of your turn, that's like usually pretty bad, or at least inconsistent. So having like Dagger, Siren's Call, hit the blue, bottom whatever you drew into the E-Strike is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's true, because it gives you the ability to just convert the card in a meaningful way, basically, even if it doesn't do anything for you. You're just using it as like pitch fodder, essentially, for the E-Strike. Makes sense. What else do we have? We had the question, are we looking at hand disruption or are we looking for anything else? I mean, any kind of disruption, I guess, like depending on what your opponent is, right? If I'm playing against the Zen, I kind of don't care if I hit them with like Amnesia or Weakest Link, as long as it means they don't get to play their turn the way they want to. So either you have disrupting in the form of actually stripping cards, so you got like your Command and Conquer, Leave No Witnesses, Surgical, etc., or you have disruptive effects in the form of Censor or Amnesia, where you can, or even like Warmongers against Azalea, right? Where you can just force them to play in a certain way where you don't let them have their turn the way they want to, basically. So either of those is fine, in my opinion. It just depends on what hero you're up against and what their game plan is. And then you have to figure out how to disrupt them the best way, basically, right? So, for example, against Zen, sometimes if you play like Codex and they bring back a card from their graveyard, sometimes you don't even want to you don't even want to get CNC. Sometimes you just want to get like a Surgical to tax their hand even further. Stuff like that, where you don't necessarily need to blow up their arsenal straight away, and taxing their hand even more might actually be the better play. But it's like usually, there's a meme basically in the Assassin community where the most frequent answer we give to people asking questions is it depends, because it's really a lot of the time it does depend on what exactly the game state at that moment is, and there's no good like catch-all answer for that, I guess.
I think one thing I would say is like, one thing I've noticed with my list is, and the reason I'm running a lot of the discard disruption and not other disruption, is something we talked about earlier, right? Is discard disruption or arsenal disruption is kind of exponential. Whereas like obviously in a more defensive list, any kind of disruption works. But in a deck that's like there are sometimes you mask your opponent's 3-card hand is still fantastic, and an extra discard effect changes their hand from being like 14, 15 value to like 6 value. And that becomes worth way, way more than like censor trying to name the right card.
True. Yeah. I
Can
mean,
I ask you a question on this topic?
mhm.
Cut down to size is a non-bow with the mask. Have you mitigated this through just your play?
Yeah, so I definitely see how like on its surface cut down the size and mask are non-bow. I find, at least so far in testing, I haven't tested against quite a lot of people with cut down the size. I think I've only resolved it like 7 or 8 times so far. Most of the times the opponent just blocks with whatever their worst card in hand is anyway, and then that mask activation becomes fantastic there. If you like you and you do other pattern things, right? Like you start with cut down the size. If you hit with a Mistblade for the turn and have another disruptive piece, um, if they just don't block and they're like, my hand's no blocks, or I'm just fine taking 4 and discarding a card, then you get your chi into arsenal, which like isn't the best, but it does allow for whatever your next cycle is, whatever disruptive piece you throw that turn, again throwing the same like checkmate scenario. If you throw another cut down to size and again they just don't block, at that point you're starting to leak a lot of damage, and that helps us with our game plan quite a lot.
Yeah, this all makes sense as you say it. And even as I was asking, I was thinking, if they do just say no blocks, you can arsenal the transcend, and that's not so bad. And kind of a follow up I have then. I'm guessing you've tried other cards in this slot, like Pursuit of Knowledge or etc. And even that there are kind of red versions of these generics that maybe Uzuri would look at. I don't know, Humble or right. So like, there's quite a few in this 2-cost 4-power regime. So what do you think of the other ones?
Yeah, so I have in my maybe board right now, I have Death Touch, Humble, and Pursuit as things to try for sure. I think you could probably split between all of them. Um, I have found that cut down the size is the most universal synergistic disruption of the 4 so far, but I could 100% see Pursuit being in that slot or Death Touch being in that slot or whatever, depending on what exactly. I think, as we've talked about, the meta is super wide right now. What exactly you're trying to tech against? I find cut down the size better than like Blue Humble or Blue Death Touch against Zen. Like Zen does not care. It's Pursuit especially. Zen does not care if you have a 5-card hand. They're just gonna blow you up. They care way more about their own cards than yours.
I think this can be true. So drawing the 5th card can be like gaining life if they decide not to block the Pursuit. So, and I do understand that making them discard it scales a bit harder than 3 life. It's probably more like 4.5 on average, something like that. Yeah, so it'll be interesting to see where you settle with this. I mean, it's definitely the card that's the backup to Surgical. So none of them are kind of ideal, but
Yeah.
yeah, we'll stay tuned, I suppose.
I think that's kind of like you're looking at this is cut down to size. Like this discussion is kind of like fine tuning which blue 3 cost 5 you bring in Kayo, essentially, right? It's like it's not a good choice, but it's the best choice you have, and then you have to kind of decide between equal levels of bad, essentially, and you just have to kind of fine tune it. It's like the third disruptive cycle that you bring in Uzuri, basically, where you can bring, or you used to be able to choose between like Humble and Erase Face and Amnesia, and all of them were just kind of like and then you just had different up and down sides for each of them, but you were like, right, I know that these are not going to matter into everything, so I kind of have to decide which one does the most into the current meta, basically. So it became a meta call. And then a lot of lists weren't running any of them. And that was kind of like the end result, where people were just like, yeah, these don't do enough for me to actually include them. Which I think right now is not the case. But in the meta we had back then, right, like the heavy hitters meta, I think that was absolutely a thing where people were just like, I don't need these extra 2 cost 6s because they're just not disruptive enough at the moment. Right, so another question that we got was, Tom, when do you bring 4 chi and what matchups? And I think that could probably be answered by just looking at the matchups.
Yeah, the matchup guide is complete.
Yep. So if you look over
Um,
here, you go into matchups, everything is in there and everything is up to date. So you can probably just look that over. But maybe, Tom, you can give us like a general idea of when do you bring more chi? Do you ever bring less than 4 if you do bring chi? So is it like a gradual thing where sometimes you bring 1 or 2 or 3, or is it like no chi or all chi?
Right. I'll answer this in 2 parts. The first one is my sideboard methodology tends to be I want to play the 60 cards that are the least bad into the matchup because once again, like we're on E-Strike, we're already conceding that cards aren't perfectly optimal in every matchup.
Yeah,
so
sure.
the cards that are least bad go in, and sometimes the cards that are least bad are the chi, and sometimes they're not. So a good example of when you want most of the chi, or all 4, I suppose, is Kayo. The reason is they all interact pretty favorably with your game plan. Passover and the Sacred Art both target a blue in their graveyard to set up kind of this end game kill on the KO opponent. Path Well Traveled is just ubiquitously good, especially when Flesh Bag exists. Path Well Traveled can give you some interesting bait scenarios. And then because our game plan into KO revolves around a pivot using Traverse the Universe, you do need like a certain density of chi, and 4 has kind of been the spot where I felt most comfortable actually being able to tuck a chi into my deck in the first cycle. And Homage to Ancestor just being the 4th chi kind of ubiquitously good. It was Rising Sun Setting Moon for a long time, but I just never really found the hand fixing to be pivotal. It's the same idea that I mentioned with drawing a random card on your turn. Like mostly you just want to play on your turn and be done with it. And the even though there's no like cost per se to draw and bottom on Rising Sun, it doesn't actually generate you value if you've already planned your turn. Like it gets you something if somehow you drew into a better card. Otherwise, Homage is just always the 1 value. So that's why it's the 4th.
Yeah, makes sense. I think Homage is like you said, it's the least bad. I think that's probably a good way to put it. I think the effect is kind of like not very strong. And like you also mentioned, if you could run 3 copies of Path, you probably would, just because that's kind of like the best thing you can do. But Homage is just, it's always life. It always gives you 1 value, and having life is a good thing, right? Like anyone who's ever run sigils will tell you that gaining life is something that's pretty powerful, especially if you can do it at instant speed. So, all right. So Abby will have to leave us in a couple of minutes. So if anybody in here has any questions for her and her specific list, drop them now. Or otherwise drop them in the comments below the video, right? There's obviously going to be a VOD of the stream. So if you're watching this at a later point in time because you couldn't catch it live, feel free to leave any questions that you have for either of those 2 down in the comments below, and then I can pass them along, or they can read them if they check the comments and try to answer those questions. So, or is there anything that you want to share about your list in particular for anybody that wants to try it out? Like maybe any particular patterns that you have to kind of get your mind into if you want to try this list? Because I think it's a very particular list, and you have to approach it with a specific mindset for it to actually work.
Yeah, I think the 2 big things I would say while we're waiting on questions, or I guess the 3 things, is 1, as I mentioned earlier, arsenaling attacks is incredibly important. It helps a lot of your ability to have consistent disruption. However, chi is like the next best thing. kind of like that priority list. And if you have to, you can put a react or a token made there.
Mm-hmm.
You really don't want to. Sometimes it's worth it to just burn the Slither just to not have the dead arsenal, so that
Mm-hmm.
next turn you can arsenal and attack.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing I would say is this list is not um, for the faint-hearted or for those who have trouble pitch stacking. Both of those
Mm-hmm.
are really important skills for this list in ways I don't think are normally really important for new.
Mm-hmm.
There are some matchups that are unwinnable if you can't pitch stack.
Okay.
If you can, it's easy, but like you do need to know when you're drawing certain cards. Like the second you cast Stir the Pot, after that you need to be counting a little bit, where are my reacts, where are my attacks,
Mm-hmm.
am I pitching stuff together, where is my swing turn coming in second cycle. If you
Mm-hmm.
do not do that, then after first cycle you will just lose and fall over. Um, the third thing I will say is, um, again, this is mentioned a little bit earlier, but equipment, including the weapons, it's incredibly important to utilize correctly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Mistblade is one of those cards that the first time you swing it, the first few times you swing it in the game, seeing how your opponent blocks is something you have to pay attention to and have to use throughout the rest of the game.
Mm-hmm.
If you swing your first beckoning Mistblade and they are always blocking it, fantastic. Does not matter what your hand is, you swing the second one, now you enter them into the same scenario again. And then throughout the game, you prioritize over swinging Mistblades. The
Mm-hmm.
equipment, as we've mentioned, of Rowdy locals is sometimes worth using there, but for the most part, you want to save these for either a huge swing codex turn
Mm-hmm.
or specifically for bonds.
Yeah.
Resolving all three bonds fully online is really important to making this list work consistently,
Mm-hmm.
even with the 12 reacts and the equipment. There are times you're going to draw bonds, your second bonds, your third bonds, and it'll be completely textless. So
Mm-hmm.
being very conscious of like, sometimes CNC for 6, they block 6. That's actually a really hard decision if you block wave there, even if like they've shown you that they have a valuable arsenal. Because
Right. Okay.
otherwise you might draw bonds later and
Yeah.
that bonds is just textless, and that's one of the ways you can lose is that, okay, now I have no disruption here. And those are the
Okay.
three big things I would definitely focus on.
So basically, settle for they gave me 2 cards. They're gonna have a turn that's gonna be already kind of mid. I don't need to overcommit here. I'd rather save the wave for the bonds that I'm gonna draw 2, 3, 4 turn cycles down the road, and then have
Yep.
that like incredibly insane 2 card bonds hand with like just a nick or something available.
Yep.
That is probably the most powerful play New can make is like bonds, just a nick, tunic for a rousing wave. Just bonds for 10 off of 2 cards. Uh, Once you resolve that, it just feels completely disgusting, and there's not a lot people can do to play around it because it's 10 damage off of 2 cards. That alone is absurd in itself. And then the fact that it also has probably the most disruptive on hit in the entire game attached to it. Maybe outside of something like Crippling Crush. I don't know. Could be more. It's hard to kind of put a value to that. But I think Bonds is definitely one of the most awful on hits in the game for the opponent to face. So having that still be an option for you because you decided to be patient with your equipment is definitely powerful. Yeah, I can agree with that. I guess, again, it depends, right? There's going to be situations where forcing the just a nick or like forcing the on hit of the CNC through is relevant. There's gonna be times where your opponent is trying to bait you into doing that when they have something in arsenal that they don't really care about, but they're trying to play in a way to make you think that they care about it. So you commit the arousing wave too early, stuff like that. You know, that's just gonna take some practice to find the correct patterns for that kind of stuff. What's 10 damage, 2 cards? Like you play Bonds of Agony, right? Then you play Just a Nick, and then you use your Tunic counter. You have Tunic up in this scenario. You use your Tunic counter to crack a Rousing Wave. And then a Rousing Wave gives you a Fang Strike, and you use that on your Bonds. So you fulfill the condition of Bonds, where you have played or activated 3 or more attack reactions. So it gets +3 and the on-hit effect, and it hits for 10. So you've used 2 cards and a Tunic counter and a piece of equipment to get 10 damage on Bonds of Agony and the effect life. So yeah, That's probably, I think, the single most powerful play Nu can make, in my opinion. Outside of something that involves like playing 3 copies of Levels of Enlightenment, I guess, or some kind of insane combo turn into Kayo where you can just hit them for 20 with their own cards, stuff like that. But if we're talking like normal Nu plays, I think the 2-card Bonds combo is probably the best. Yeah. All right. Okay. So as far as I can see, we don't have any specific questions for Abby. So again, if you figure out anything that you want to know about her list or any questions you want to ask her, just leave them down in the comments. Or you can join the Spider's Web Assassin Discord. We're all active on there as well. So the link to that is in the description of the video as well. If you want to join up and just ask questions, chat about Assassin, feel free to join. We're all very friendly. We don't bite. So just come over, have a chat, say hi. And yeah, with that, Abby, I think it is time for you to go. Was that correct?
Yes, yep. I appreciate getting to be on and talk about my list. Again, as you mentioned, I will be active in the comments. I'm incredibly active in the Discord. I'm always open for DMs or people to talk to me about my list and talk through lines and stuff. I think the list can be very, very technical in a way that that's very different than the way like Azuri or Arachne played.
Definitely, yeah.
But yeah, good luck to everyone. I think Nu has a lot of different ways we can take her, and it's fun to see all the different ways people are currently building her.
All right. Thanks for being here. Thanks for talking about your list. It's really, I think it stands out at the moment as just kind of like a very unique way to build Nu. And not a lot of people are exploring this like all gas, all chi, full disruption kind of style. So I'm very happy I could have you on here to talk about that kind as sort of like a counterpoint to the more, I want to say, almost traditional kind of Nu lists, if we can always already call it that, that Tom and Co ran at the US Nats. So, all right. Thanks for being here.
No problem.
All right. Okay. All right. And yeah. Okay. So, Tom, should we maybe just play a game on your list? Just kind of see how it operates in action? Or is there anything that you would like to talk about more? Some kind of thesis or anything else that you want to share with people?
I feel like there should be something else that I have to say. So when it comes to, defining the gameplay loop, as people like to say, for Nu, this is where you have just almost everything available to you. You can do the mask like Abby, you can do no mask like P, you can play defensive or like hyper aggro, and I really don't think there's going to be a correct way to do this, if you will. For a lot of Uzuri's life in the game, I was of the opinion there was just a right way to play her, and a right way to build the deck. And a lot of this came from a limited card pool. Some things just did the job better than others.
True.
But Nu has so many tools and a pretty clear place in the meta that really I wouldn't let anything like that today discourage you from trying your own ideas with the hero, and that kind of that's ultimately the intent. That I can explain the reasoning that we came to, and someone can kind of interrogate and make it better.
I think it's kind of interesting because Nu is like the first example we've had of a new class making it into the game as a base class and then a talented version of that class appearing later, right? Unless we're taking like the first 2 sets, obviously, right? But if you look at, for example, the last class that was added to the game was Illusionist, right? And we never had an untalented Illusionist in the game. So we don't actually know what that looks like. we have like an idea based on the cards that we got from Everfest to an extent, but we don't really know what an untalented illusionist would actually want to do, or if that's actually something the devs ever want to put into the game, right? Whereas with Assassin, we got the untalented versions first, and then we have New, which kind of just like expands that card pool and adds the talent on top of it, right? Even though I feel specifically for New, her talented cards don't actually interact with her talent a lot, right? Like the Mystic Assassin cards don't care about Chi for the most part, except for obviously like Undercurrent and I guess Gorgon's Gaze, which is just kind of universally accepted to be pretty bad, unfortunately. And all of the others are just like, it's a good attack reaction that works on any Assassin card and any Mystic card, which is really something that Assassin has been lacking so far. Is like attack reactions that don't have these like incredibly restrictive things added to them, where like Cut to the Chase only works on stealth, only works on contracts. Razor's Edge and Spikes only work on stealth cards. Shred requires your opponent to actually block before you can use it. Same for Spreading Plague, stuff like that, right? Where the reactions that you had access to as Assassin were typically either restrictive, bad, or both. And New is kind of the first one that can actually just play reactions that work on any Assassin card you can play, and they're actually on rate or sometimes even above rate, and you just want to include those in the deck. That's kind of like the unique thing I think she has going for her over like Uzuri or Arachne, is that she has access to this additional axis of gameplay that the other two could run, but frankly just wasn't very good. So you didn't really include those cards, I think.
Yeah, and on this topic, I will talk a little bit about Red Hiss.
Mm-hmm.
This card has like decreased in popularity for me and my group, basically since the original version where 3 were in the deck. And I find it strange because this is, to your point, one of those react that is kind of above rate. 1 for 3 itself kind of having go again because it's reaction speed, right? It does not consume your action point, and then it gives you another one.
Yeah.
Sounds kind of great on paper. But it just kind of turns out that you need a target that's relevant for this to become great. And the targets that, at least in our version of the deck, the targets that you tend to want to play are blue 1-power stealth. Right? You want to be able to maximize the Just the Nick interactions with bonds and persuasive, and the Red Hiss just kind of is there. There are the more obvious answers like Leave No Witness and Surgical. And Hiss is very good on those. And I think for that reason it's still at 1. It just like hasn't quite been bad enough to push out all the way, but it might be close.
I think that the main issue with Hiss is like that it requires 4-card hands at minimum to actually be relevant. And that's kind of like the issue, that I think a lot of people are starting to realize with the card is if you're not in a position where you have enough tempo to keep 4-card hands, it's just kind of bad because you need a target for it, then you need a blue pitch because otherwise you don't get the Slither, and then you need a third card that you can play after you use the Slither on your first card. So it's mitigated a little bit by being able to arsenal the Slither. And Slither and Arsenal is pretty good because you can just, extend that go again to your next turn. So you can kind of like bank an action point in a way. But it can also lock up your Arsenal if you're playing from a spot where you're behind. So you need to have tempo to be able to actually utilize that go again. That's kind of the issue, unless you draw into something like Leave No Witnesses and Leave No Witnesses. So if you have double Leave No Witnesses, obviously you're fine blocking with 2 cards, keeping 2, and then having that Slither and Arsenal is great. Or if you can go like E-Strike 7, go again into something, or E-Strike 5, draw a card into something because you have that Slither. But Slither and Arsenal can clunk you up pretty badly sometimes. So I can absolutely see dropping his if you're playing a more defensive list where you just go, I don't expect to have enough tempo to really utilize this card to its full extent. And I think a lot of Assassin lists naturally kind of gravitate towards that simply because Assassin doesn't really convert large hands efficiently. Even Nu doesn't do that with her all of her reactions and everything. I think Nu wants to play towards like 3-card hands typically. That's like her ideal hand size. And depending on the list, you can scale that up or down a little bit. But I think the central strategy is like try to play good 3-card hands. That's kind of what you're going for in a lot of situations.
Yeah, and this clause on his is just kind of, it is pretty obnoxious, honestly. Right? You need to pitch the blue card to make the Slither. Because the deck wants some number of blues to enable this and Venomous Bite, and you need some number of blue stealth that supports looking for a scrap, right?
Yep.
So there's all these little facets that have to be optimized all at once. And Red Hiss is like, it adds another facet. It says, I want to target something that's not 1 power.
Yep.
Right? So it's looking for a very specific attack action, Assassin or Mystic. Yeah. And there just aren't too many of those that are worth running. Like I even at one point, in trying to kind of solidify the Enigma matchup, I tried 3-hit and I cycled through different red assassin cards. Like I tried, Plunder the Poor, 0-cost contract. I tried Double Trouble. I tried Bonds of Attraction, Art of Desire. All of these in red, just to see if more targets for Hiss made it feel better. But of course, those other cards have their own non-bow draws that don't actually fit the mold of the strategy. Yeah. And then one closing thought on this, if you don't mind, is this is something I've kind of adopted from a friend of mine, Guy Cohen, who worked on the deck with me. It was me, Guy, and Joe Santiana who had the finish, as we mentioned earlier. This idea that having not 3 copies of something in your deck has real value against players who track these things. So you could have someone who looks through your yard, sees the 1 Red Hiss, and thinks, okay, copies 2 and 3 are surely coming soon. And you never have it. So you get like an implicit fork just by having it in your deck. And it's the same reason there's 1 blue shred.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
I was kind of wondering about that, like what that card was actually doing in the deck. Yeah. Okay, makes sense. Yeah. So it's kind of like the classic run a single copy of Pummel just to mind game your opponent.
Yep, pretty much. Okay. Because these cards, like, the upside is there, the downside is they are 3 block, and then they have this like mind game thing going for them. So sure. It's still part of this conversation of you don't have the full metagame prediction because you can't, and you need to make a choice on some card choices. And I think Red Hiss and the 1 shred kind of fall into that.
I think one issue I have with Hiss specifically is that it naturally encourages you to use a blue pitch, obviously, because you want to get the Slither token, right? And then you're left with 2 resources. And Nu does not have a way to efficiently spend 2 resources on a lot of turn cycles, with the exception of that being daggers, right? So the natural kind of line that you end up running when you try to play Hiss is like you have a stealth card maybe, you have a blue, and you just go like dagger into stealth, into Hiss, into whatever your follow-up is, like a Codex or Leave No Witnesses or another blue stealth, right? And the problem with that specifically is if you're playing like Mistblade, right? And you attack with Mistblade and then it hits, you don't need the hiss anymore. So the go again part of the hiss suddenly became irrelevant, and you would rather have Venomous Bite in that spot, right? If you're attacking with another dagger, right? You're telling your opponent basically, yeah, don't block whatever is coming now, and maybe they don't, maybe they do. You know, it's kind of like at that point it's a little bit of a gamble, right? If they want to block it or not, but still, it's kind of like slightly inefficient to just spend those 2 resources on a dagger when you don't have to, you know? Like, unless that's a big part of your gameplay is daggering every single turn. And in some matchups, I guess that still is the case. But for the most part, you'd rather spend those 2 resources on something like a Command and Conquer, for example. Obviously, if your turn cycle is like, I don't know, leave no witnesses, into blue hiss, into hiss, into Command and Conquer, and that's something you can line up. That's ideal, right? If that is something you can manage to do, or you start with like prognosis, maybe they overblock it, and you just go, okay, hiss. It doesn't hit, but it's fine because I get the go again, and then I can go CNC, and you don't have cards to block anymore. That's fantastic, but you don't run a lot of 2 costs in new. So I think the main issue with his is that it kind of doesn't really fit her cost curve in a way where you can really efficiently utilize those 2 resources. So the only card I can see that's really amazing with his is basically Codex, right? Because you can go like blue stealth into his 2 floating, Codex, CNC, like your standard bread and butter stuff. Play your Codex when you have 2 floating so you can get back CNC or whatever it is that you want to bring back the costs to, right? So in that sense, it's a pretty good card. But I think the main issue and why it has started to feel bad for so many people is that this kind of play pattern doesn't line up a lot in new, I think. So you're going to have turns where that lines up and then it's fantastic. But I would say probably like 3 times out of 4, something like that, you don't have an efficient way to spend 2 resources on your turn cycle. So pitching to his kind of feels bad. I think that's kind of one of the reasons why the card feels a little bit underwhelming maybe. And then coupled with the fact that it encourages you to keep large hands when that's not something that you naturally want to do in Assassin a lot of the times.
Yeah, I agree with pretty much all of this. But it's interesting that you're on the Zen sideboard right now because there's significantly more 2 cost cards in this than the other plans.
That's actually fair,
which I want to talk to, and then maybe we can get into a game. So this sideboard plan for Zen, you'll notice the excluded cards are an Enlightened Strike, Just the Nick, and Fate Foreseen.
Yep.
Which seems kind of haphazard. Like, why would you be cutting Just the Nick into Zen? You need to disrupt them. Because these 2 cost cards are so good at doing the disruptive part, you actually do have a cost curve that wants to build around them. So E-Strike doesn't do as good a job as looking for a scrap, which is all 3 copies.
Yep.
And likewise, Just a Nick is super clunky with your Amnesia and your Weakest Link.
Makes sense.
Yeah, we actually are in this matchup, and pretty much only this one, kind of optimizing a little bit for the 2 cost Chain Ender.
Okay, right. Because it's the only matchup where you play all of the 2 costs in the list, basically. Like, obviously, I guess in the Kayo, you still play Weakest Link and CNC, but you don't necessarily play Amnesia. You probably don't play Censor, right? So you run less of the disruption generics, basically.
Yeah, and then one last comment on this matchup, because people should expect to see a lot of it, so I just want to be thorough.
Yeah.
The equipment suite at the top, we have Balance of Justice. As mentioned, there's no chi in this matchup, so this is just the best headpiece, and it keeps you alive on their combo turn, which usually does happen, right?
Yep.
If you can survive the combo turn, you should win the game. That's kind of how it works, and your plays should be tailored toward that. And then also notable are no Misblade. It's Scale Peeler Spider's Bite. And this is basically, again, because almost every turn that we can afford to, it makes sense to have a 2-cost Chain Ender. So a hand of 2 blues and a CNC Amnesia or Weakest Link or even Censor really does follow up nicely with these 2 daggers. That it makes their whole fridge block 3 if you hit with the Scale Peeler, which obviously is not good enough to prevent the on-hit. And then Spider's Bite is usually the best dagger to swing later in the game after they have committed the armor block.
When the fridge is already gone, yeah.
Yep.
I mean, let's just try to maybe just find a Zen to play against, you know? Let's just see if that actually works. Right, let's log in here. And then we are going to grab this. Put that here. Okay, for some reason this has not worked. I should be joined to that Patreon so I can customize the game names. Let's see if we can maybe find a Zen somewhere. There's request undo CC. Let's refresh. There's a Zen. There we go. Very nice. Another player's already joined. Dang it. There should be Zens. I feel like that should not be something that takes a long time to find.
Probably not.
Yeah. Yep. Oh, come on. What is this? Let me just get a Zen.
So while we're waiting, I can fill some airtime.
Yep.
So the Zen deck that won the tournament is playing kind of more of a mid-range style, I think you might say. So it has more chain starters. Like, I forget the name of it exactly. You pitch a blue and it makes a tiger in your hand. Attacks for 3 go again.
Yeah.
It also has spinning wheel kick.
Harmony of the Hunt, I think.
Yep, that's the one. Yeah. There's also spinning wheel kick and 100 Winds, which maybe are a bit more common. But there's also Enlightened Strike and Command and Conquer. So against a version of the deck like that, our game plan actually lines up really well. Their combo turn can be weakened somewhat by these more mid-rangey cards. Like if they do their Art of War and they draw into E-Strike CNC, they're pretty unhappy. So all of this is to say, the strategy for Zen really will be built around how the Zen deck evolves over time. And the way it's currently built is to try to mitigate and, worst case scenario, survive the biggest combo turn they could throw.
Perfect. Okay, so we found one. Do we want to go? I guess we go second, right?
Try second.
Yep.
This is quite interesting because the Zen decks oftentimes like to set up their combo cards in the grave when they go first.
Yep.
Bonds of Ancestry being the thing that can kind of tutor from the grave.
Yep.
So I have experimented with going first, and it usually feels pretty good to go first.
Okay.
So we'll get some test of the other way around.
So basically, if they make you go first, it's fine, and if they don't make you go first, it's also fine. So you're fine either way, basically.
I think so. I don't know really what the best win rate will be. But we have both of these disruptive daggers that it is pretty hard for them to actually block our thing if we go second.
So they played Shifting Winds, but they didn't pitch a chi to it, so that kind of does just nothing, I think, at this point.
Pretty much.
So they're attacking with the Kakara. I assume we block with Warmongers because that's just a card that doesn't do anything against Zen. Apart from Shifting Winds, actually.
Sure, it does affect that.
On their own attack?
Yeah.
Okay, to Transcend. Okay, that makes sense.
Just to Transcend, yeah.
Sure.
And they did it this sequencing so as not to close the chain. I suppose they'll attack with a tiger here.
Yep, makes sense.
And
to
they set up the
name
bonds
it,
for the next turn.
What are they
Sorry, the
naming it?
descendant.
That's kind of the question.
It really doesn't matter what they name it.
Mm.
They're just setting up their combo card in the grave.
Okay, they name it Surging Strike, I guess.
Oh, I guess they'll buff by +2 on their thing.
For the Descendant, yeah.
Yep.
So that'll come in for 3. I guess we can let this tiger through. And then block the Descendant, I guess, with Hold the Line. Try to keep the Surgical, maybe?
I think, given that you have the Sigil,
Yeah.
I don't mind this. But I if I were playing, I think I would put the Hold the Line on this tiger.
Hold the Line here? Sure.
I'll let you make the final choice.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Okay, like I think leaking damage just isn't good, so probably just blocking with everything is kind of the way to go.
Yep.
So this is coming in for 4. Why is this coming? Oh, because of
Shuko.
Shuko, yeah, okay, makes sense.
What a silly card.
Sure.
So much value.
Yep, it is. Very strong card for sure.
But getting to start the game at 42 is pretty nice.
Mm-hmm. Oh, they're actually finishing this with a Mauling Key.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's just coming in for 5. Yeah, okay, I guess we take 5 here, so not much we can do, and then we just play out the Sigil.
Yep. This is not the worst. I actually think our opponent is probably making a mistake.
So it's like...
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if they would want the Mauling Key. Okay, so we have Bonds, we have Nick, and we can use a Rousing Wave. We lose 1 value that way, which isn't great, but, you know, I guess we throw Spider's Bite here.
I would lead with the Peeler.
Okay.
Because, again, like, they didn't set up an arsenal. Their hand could just be total clunk, and the equipment might bail them out. That's my my rule of thumb. Also, I think usually it's correct to use the boots instead of a Rousing Wave to turn on an early Bonds.
Sure.
We do expect to defend with a lot of things, so the Gogen's not always relevant.
Not that
And
relevant.
then later in the game, the Arousing Wave, like fork, is just really obscene. You know, your CNC for 6 is actually 7.
Yeah, that's
if they
it's more
block
powerful,
poorly.
Yeah, makes sense. So I guess we lose one value on the boots here, but it's okay. Okay, so they block.
Yeah, it just kind of is what it is about the boots block. You don't know it for random cards.
Yeah, it happens. And I guess we arsenal the Leave No here, right? Because, like, I mean, we can throw it for an extra 4, but...
I am a huge fan of throwing it, actually.
Okay, sure.
Both. The reason is, usually in Fab, when you have an action point, you should spend it.
Sure.
And in our case, because we're Assassin, having an empty arsenal is quite good.
So we banish first off the Nick, right? I think it doesn't really matter, but...
Yep, usually that, because we get more info.
Okay, so it's a Fluster Fist. Okay, they have a CNC, Harmony of the Hunt, Aspect of Tiger Body. Which one do we grab? I think getting rid of all of their CNCs, Aspect, you think?
Yeah, the CNC is 2 card 6 after we throw the Leave No, right? So
yeah, that's true. Fair. But
and this Aspect of Tiger lets them do like some stupid stuff.
Okay, that's
right.
Fair.
It turns on Chase the Tail or gives them more.
Let's see what
more
they have.
ways.
So they do have Chase the Tail. They do have red bonds and blue bonds, but no yellow bonds. So this is kind of like the more mid-rangey deck.
Also 3 Snag, it looks like.
Snag. Oh yeah, they do have Snag. I am not seeing 2 Snag. I'm not seeing the 3rd right now.
All right. Just
I
two then?
think they're on 2 copies of Snag, unless I missed
Okay.
something, yeah.
Nope, that's good.
Otherwise, nothing that's like massively crazy. They do run like Mauling Key, obviously, that's a good card. So wait, we have 1 Snag, and yeah, I think it's just 2 copies of Snag.
Okay.
Sure, that works.
Pretty standard looking deck, I think.
Yep. And then obviously, because we know they have CNC, we just throw the Leave No here. They probably do not block that. It probably gives us another, another Fluster. So we got 2 Flusters out of their deck. That's actually good.
Wow. This is awesome. What a good start.
Pretty lucky for us, yeah.
Haha, look who showed up. Code Ice.
I mean, we have Surgical, right? It's not bad, actually. So they throw the 6. I think we can just block for 3 here with the Infect, and then just go double dagger into Codex.
Yep, I like
Sounds
that a
good.
lot. And the sequence you hinted at with your cursor is what I would do.
Like Scale Peeler into Spider's Bite, yeah. Like, obviously you don't lead with the Spider's Bite here. That does make no sense, yeah. Like, if you have Scale Peeler, it's always the first one that you attack with, so...
They do have lines, of course, that can get us a little bit.
So,
like if for some reason this was their big turn, they could put their stride on Spider's Bite and then the rest of the gear on Surgical, but that's okay.
So I think they're probably gonna grab the Command and Conquer here off of the Codex, which does, it's a bit annoying, but we have balance, so we can clean that like with balance and a card.
Yeah, the only consideration for the armor block on our side is the Mauling Key, because we saw a few copies of that in the deck. Otherwise, there's CNC as the on-hit.
They don't run a lot of on-hits, yeah. And Mauling Key is 1 damage, so usually CNC is a better use of that, I think.
Probably, yeah. And the CNC would come for 5, so it would only would not even cost us the Arousing Wave block.
We could use Leave No Witnesses here, but I think Surgical is still stronger, right?
Yep, it is.
Yeah.
Card selection tends to be better than random card.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, it's not random. It's their choice.
We know
probably
what
even
it
worse.
is, but like out of the 4 cards that they could potentially, or 3 cards that they could bring back, yeah. They did choose the Descendant, which is relevant because that's a starter for them. So that's actually...
Yep.
But,
probably they're holding a Transcender too.
Yep. But I mean...
Well, maybe just 1, right?
Yeah. They're not blocking here, so let's see what they have. They critically do not have a Bonds in the graveyard, so they have a Chi. They have a Bonds in hand and 100 wins. So I guess considering that they have the Descendant, we take the Bonds here. But then they can fetch a Bonds. I don't know.
Right. So what I would do is, let's weigh up how good is it to have a silver, which is what banishing the Chi does.
Yep.
Versus how good is it to remove their 3rd red Bonds from deck. We already banished 1.
Yep.
Banishing this one takes it out of the game.
Yep.
And then if they use their Chi to trigger the 3rd red Bonds, we are kind of happy, I think. So that's probably better than the silver.
Okay, makes sense, yeah. All right. That's a legitimate reasoning, yeah. I mean, they do also get the Tiger, but I think in this situation, like, they're gonna swing Kakara, and that's gonna be a little bit annoying, but I think overall their damage is gonna be relatively mid this turn.
Yeah.
And we
Something
banished,
else.
what did we banish off the top? Descendant Gust Wave. Okay, nice. So we even got a silver just through randomly banishing something.
Yep.
So these don't matter. Infect in the arsenal is not amazing, but I mean, I'll take it.
Yeah, you'll be surprised how many times Infect trades for a whole card.
And they gave up.
They're just done. Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. All right. So, actually, yeah, I think this is unfortunately kind of like the Talishar experience. People don't like playing against Assassin. That's not something that's new. I think anyone who's tried to play, not Enigma, Azuri back in the day on Talishar had the same experience. Sometimes people just really don't like playing against Assassin. And they will occasionally just rage quit, essentially, or like just leave the game because they're not having fun, which is like, fair enough. If you're not having fun with an activity that's supposed to be a hobby, like maybe reevaluate. So that's fair, I guess, to some extent.
Yeah, and I think what we saw in the first 3 turns is really not even that far from the average game with Assassin. So maybe they're just on to the next, seeing the writing on the wall.
Maybe, yeah. Could be. Just like, right, cut my losses. I can see how this is going to play out. Just going to go into the next one and hopefully maybe high roll a bit better, something like that. I don't know. I can see that. So actually, I'm going to take this as a cue to kind of segue into ending this stream. Because I can smell my wife's cooking dinner. And it smells very good.
Yeah, great.
And I don't want to miss it.
Yeah, of course.
So, yeah. All right. Yeah, no, I think I'm gonna end this here. Anyone, I mean, we got a couple minutes, so we don't have to like cut it immediately short. But anyone still watching this, like, do you guys have any questions for Tom while he's still here? Is there anything that you would like to go over that we haven't touched on already? Any aspects of new that you think we could talk over more? I'm definitely gonna do a little bit more streams in the following couple of days. Leading up to my own nationals, which are on the 26th, I think, if I remember correctly. No, it's actually on the 29th. So like 1.5 weeks from now. Definitely going to do a little bit of streaming with like new testing, stuff like that. Just trying out the deck, seeing which version of it appeals the most to me. Because I still haven't really decided. Which style of new I like the most. So there's definitely going to be some testing coming in. And yeah, if you're up for it, I would love to have you on stream again. It's always a blast doing these with you. I feel like your voice adds a lot of value to the discussion because you have a lot of like very well thought out ideas about how the deck should operate, stuff like that. Okay, so Cardfighting has another question. If you can expand about your thoughts about red stealth cards in new, and also what your thoughts are about Intimate Inducement, which is a card that I think nobody has really tried out seriously so far, or at least I haven't seen it in any lists that have made an impact at an event or anything.
Right. The red stealth card, I tried almost all of them from MST. I haven't tried any of them from the earlier expansions. What I can say about them is kind of the same thing I would say about E-Strike or Amnesia. These cards that are in a slot that's a red attack. You either have to choose to make something generically playable or choose to make it a hate card. So for instance, like the aspect of desire or art of desire red, we have the blue version, but the red one, for instance, is extremely good against Azalea. It's really hard to not gain a life and draw a card with that against Azalea when you cast it. So if you knew your whole meta was Azalea, like instant 3-up that card. And it probably replaces each strike or something like that. But we we don't know for sure if it's Azalea, and blocks are tight. So
right.
It just in general for the red stealth, that was just an example. But in general for the red stealth, it's hard to find the one ubiquitous red stealth. if there was a ubiquitous one, I think it's Double Trouble.
Mm-hmm.
However, there's a card that does a very similar thing to Red Double Trouble on it. All of the red 0/4 contracts.
Yeah.
Which, like, the overlap is so close, right? Double Trouble banishes 2, but you need to do the double react. Compared to the contracts, only banish 1, but they come in for 4 always, and you don't need to react. So
Yeah.
even Red Double Trouble is like not really fighting that well for its place.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's the red stealth. The inducement, intimate inducement. This is a card that when I first saw it spoiled, I thought it was unplayable because the failure mode is ridiculous. You de-react yourself. You know, they get +3 in reaction speed on it. Like, it's just so bad, right? But I've played with it in limited. Maybe not as part of an optimal new draft deck, but as kind of a filler card. And specifically, the red version against Enigma can be really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
They want to put these auras in their deck that don't have block value, because that's one of the strongest things that deck can do. And looking at the top 4 cards of a 30-card deck and hitting like a Waxing Spectre is really good.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you basically like played Pick to pieces a turn cycle ahead to kill their Waxing Spectre
Mm-hmm.
and take it out of the limited match. Which yeah, so that's impressed me quite a bit. I wouldn't be surprised if in CC a strategy to beat Enigma involves inducement because of this. Like let's say you snipe a manifestation of mirror, right? Like, you know, killing that is not easy for us, and you can do it kind of ahead of time. So there's potential.
Like, I think the list. I've seen some Arachne players basically say that intimate inducement feels a bit like coercive tendency to them, simply because a lot of times what you're looking for with coercive is not necessarily the go again, which is like at face value, that's what you use it for. It's like this big blowout, throw like 4 or 5 contracts at them and just stack up a bunch of silver. But what ends up happening in a lot of matchups is that you use it to specifically snipe out power cards from their deck. So you just use the ability to look at the top 3 cards and then you set up the banishes in a way that you take out their power cards. And I think this is something that inducement does exactly the same thing, even better in red, because you get to look at an extra card, right? So it's kind of like more powerful in that regard. I think a list outside of like, you know, specific targeted hate, like versus Enigma, like you mentioned, I think a list where intimate inducement might play a big role is if you're trying to build specifically a fatigue-oriented Enigma, a new list. So something like a either stealth-based, but not really looking for like big disruption, but just looking for the I banish off of the stealth, that kind of effect. Or you just look at like a contract new list, right? Where you just play all of the 0/4, 1/5 contracts. You're basically an Arachne deck with better attack reactions, and you're trying to just run the opponent out of cards, and that's your whole game plan. And I think in that kind of list, intimate inducement could potentially be pretty strong, because your opponents aren't going to block contracts a lot of the time. So you attack them with a 0/4, and then your contract still hits if you activate inducement on it, even if they use like a D-react, if they use a sync to cleanly block it, because it gives you +1, you still go over, so you banish a card from hitting with the contract, and you banish an extra card, quote unquote, because you force them to block with it with inducement, and you get to dig 4 cards deep, and you get to set up whatever you banish with the contract on top of that. So you basically banish 2 cards that you get to choose from the top 4 cards of their deck. And I think that's something that could be potentially pretty powerful, where you're not playing for like damage, you're not playing for value, you're playing to survive until they run out of cards, and you can use intimate inducement to kind of like make their turns worse. Basically, that's what Arachne has always been about, is like using Arachne's hero ability to make the opponent's turn cycles worse by bottoming cards that they care about, And then Intimate Inducement does kind of the same thing, except you get to look at their whole entire next hand. And then you get to pick whatever the best card from that hand is and just remove it. I think that's a way that you could use that card in a way that's really powerful, but I don't know if that's a deck that's as good as just going for the new plans that we're seeing right now, which are more proactive. So
I see another question here
yeah.
from Wylan. Says, would you change anything in your deck after Nat? I do have specifically a weakness that I want to address, which either I address it by tweaking what's here or coming up with a new plan. And the weakness is that against Enigma, there are draws that just let them run away with the game. And I don't really know if the fix to this is like a density of solution cards type of thing, or if the deck is just built poorly for fighting Enigma. But that one thing that really should be addressed before I take this to another big event. It's like you look here and you see the 3 strike, and you got looking for a scrap, and there's like some decent amount of go wide potential. You have path, you have levels. But then you also look and you see there's like Censor, Amnesia, and 3 weakest link, and indeed in the sideboard is just like a bunch of reactions. And these are the cards that are least bad, right? But it turns out like the 2 for 6s are also kind of bad. The on hits rarely matter, and the rate on the damage is like it's just okay. So the configuration for Enigma is the things you want to keep in mind are to swing double dagger as frequently as you can, because anything higher than Ward 1 really does struggle to deal with this. So that means your blue count matters. And then the other thing that's important is kind of having these, I call them scams, available to you. So Siren's Call is one of the biggest ones. All their best cards in the deck are blue, and they need at least 1 blue for their turn to function at all. So, building your deck so that Siren's Call is taken advantage of is also pretty important. Specifically, the changes I would try to make are probably to increase the blue count and to have a game plan that uses the chi a little bit better. Like the 4 transcend cards here are just kind of there.
Yeah.
They don't contribute too much unless the opponent is didn't have a plan for us and leaves in good blue attack actions. So yeah, that's where I would make changes.
So if you're saying you want more blues and you want more cards that use chi well, I can think of the one card that fits both criteria, which would be second tenet of chi, Wind, I think, the one that gets go again when you transcend. So that's maybe something that is worth looking at in that regard. I don't know if it's actually worth it, but let me just look at it. Yeah, no, it was Wind, right? Tide gets the +2, and Moon draws a card. Yeah.
So I think of the 3, Tide would be my preferred one, just sort of theoretically. The bottleneck against Enigma is how much damage you deal. So while drawing a card is probably more value, you kind of just want to stack the damage on a single turn cycle. It's right to break all her ward.
Yeah.
So I think a Tide would be the best one, and that potentially involves having more chi in the deck in general, and this could also incentivize the list to go back to Mask and try to optimize for that. So the Enigma plan may warp the deck entirely, but that's worth it if everything turns out better anyway. So
I mean, the question is really like how big is an Enigma going to be moving forward, right? Is kind of like the big question. So far, she's put up really good results. She's been in basically every top 8 of any event, I think, that has been played so far. not usually hugely represented, but like one Enigma or so typically makes it through. And the question is, like you said, with US Nats, if that was because of draft or because Enigma is a deck that actually has ways to counter Zen in some regard, right? Where she can kind of keep up with him. Which is like, Dense Blue Mist is obviously fantastic against Zen. You could run like Stonewall Gauntlet. So I think Enigma has ways to tech against Zen. I don't know if those ways are enough to stop him from running her over most of the time. Hard to answer for me. Like, I don't play Ninja, I don't play Illusionist, so it's kind of hard for me to kind of accurately, gauge where those matchups go a lot of the time.
Yeah, it's gonna be tricky to come up with, the perfect configuration. I mean, what I can say our list did really well is it fought the big three like Azalea, Kayo, and Zen. Those three proactive decks stood almost no chance to us on the weekend. And our weak spot really was highlighted only in one round out of the 24 CC the three of us played. So it really isn't the end of the world if we can't get the Enigma plan better. But if you can do that and also not lose in the other matchups, then that's just a better deck. That's where we want to be. So stay tuned.
All right. I will be watching with interest for sure. If you can crack a deck that's really good against everything in the next, let's say, maybe, I don't know, 1.5 weeks, I'm here for it.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. And then there was somebody asking for advice specifically against somebody named Joey Santiago, which I think was
one of my friends.
One of your teammates, right? So.
Yeah. Nini is trolling you.
Yeah.
Don't worry. Yeah.
That's fair. I'm okay with being trolled. As long as the trollers leave a like, I'm fine with that. Troll me as much as you want. Just keep the clicks up. I need YouTube money. Nah, I'm kidding. All right. With that, I think it's time to end the stream for today. Thank you, Tom, for being here. Thank you for talking over all of these points. I've had a great time as always. And thanks to anybody watching this and still watching. Like I already mentioned, the link to the decks that we reviewed today is in the description of the video. There's also a link to the Spider's Web Assassin Discord if you want to join up and just chat with any of us. We're all pretty active on there. And if you enjoyed the custom Plague Hive sleeves that you saw on Talishar for a short amount of time, unfortunately only, those are available on my Patreon if you want to have those. And a huge shout out to Ollie, aka Archon Altus, for actually doing that artwork. They really turned out fantastic. I'm just gonna, because I love them so much, I'm just gonna put them on screen for a second here, just because they really look amazing. Where were they? Here we go. Just gonna put that in here. That is way too large.
But you can see how much detail.
Yeah, there's a ton of detail. Like, those are in a way higher resolution than you need for Talishar. But yeah, so if you would like to have that facing you on Talishar and your opponents seeing that on Talishar, check out the Patreon, and then maybe you can play those and you can enjoy those as well. All right, with that out of the way, thank you guys for watching, and see you in the next stream. Bye.
See ya.